They are the enemies of all mankind. Grotesque creatures with terrifying powers appeared out of nowhere, formed an army and threatened humanity's existence. Any human beings who stood in their path were trampled and slaughtered. These uninvited visitors from beyond the uncharted wastelands instilled one emotion in the hearts of all humans: fear. Thus, such beings were called monsters. Meet Keith Brandon, who skipped 5 grade levels at the Night Academy and remained at the top of his class until graduation. He received such high praise that he became the youngest person to be awarded the title of Sage. It was only given to a few individuals who had made notable achievements for the country. He finally joined one of the Night Orders, and yet somehow he managed to get demobilized within a little over a year. He was the ex-member of the 11th Night Order. A blonde man exclaimed that he expected it to happen eventually. In fact, he praised Keith for lasting an entire year. Keith felt that it couldn't be helped as he was just not a good team player. The blonde-haired man is the first prince, Alan Scotland. He expected Keith to cause trouble sooner than this, but he managed to survive for the past year in the 11th Night Order. Alan assured Keith that he would do something about his quarrel with the 11th Night Order. Keith also agreed to that, but he felt that their commander's future wasn't looking bright at all. The commander of the 11th Night Corps, Count Benoit, referred to Keith as a scumbag who ignored his strategy. Keith replied that he didn't ignore it but adapted to the situation which had changed. Benoit is mad because Keith ignored his orders and acted like he owned that place. Keith inquired about the problem when they suffered no casualties and destroyed all the monsters successfully. Benoit argued that it wasn't just about results, but it was about Keith going against the order and jeopardizing their duty. He didn't want Keith to speak to him in that way. He reminded Keith that he was the current head of the Barrier family who has led to numerous victories in the human-monster war. Keith corrected him that he was speaking to him normally and didn't forget to mention that the one who had led them to many victories was his predecessor, Eric Barrier. Benoit got so mad about Keith's attitude towards him. He drew his sword along with its sheath to beat him. But Keith dodged it quite easily. Keith felt that the 11th Night Order would be much better off if Benoit was strong enough to beat him up. He punched the face of his commander as he wasn't able to stand his selfishness. Every other knight was shocked to see that, as it was the worst disgrace to a commander to be beaten by his juniors. Back to present, Alan still couldn't believe that Keith punched a noble. He was at the age of 20 and he still behaved like a child. Keith asked Alan to replace the superior of the 11th Night Order. But Alan mentioned that it would be hard to accomplish. The Noble Council has a lot of control over the members of the Night Orders, and they couldn't be able to do something about it on their own. To be fair, Alan wanted to punish Benoit as well, but he couldn't. In the end, Keith was demobilized. Keith didn't believe that, as he thought that he would be sent to the battlefield again. But Alan explained that the Noble Council was involved that time. They publicly called Alan out and ordered him to refrain from assigning him to any other Night Order. Keith was worried as he thought that he had caused problems for Alan. But Alan assured him that Keith casting trouble was already part of his calculations. The 11th Night Order has the lowest rank among the Night Orders. So if a troublemaker like him were to be reassigned to a high-ranking order, it would cause a bad example. Since he punched the commander, which is a criminal offense. Keith wondered about what he was going to do, and he hated to do research as his full time. Alan refused as he knew that Keith is capable of much more than that. But even if he sent him to the front lines alone, he wouldn't get the results he was looking for. Alan believed that right now none of the Night Orders have the power to reclaim Keith's birthplace, which was under the monster's influence. Keith also agreed with that. To solve it, Alan believed that they needed a fundamental change. He explained that Celine, who is their friend, had been begging him to let her have Keith for a while. Keith was taken back to hear that Cell had been working at the academy. Alan explained that Cell is the board chairman at the Royal Knight Academy. And she wants Keith to become a teacher and raise the next generation of knights. Keith was shocked to hear that, as he couldn't even imagine himself as a teacher. He reminded Alan that most of his abilities are self-taught. He used various reasons to refuse, but Alan mentioned that everything had already been decided. Keith has to start working as a teacher next month. Keith was mad about that, as there were only 2 days left for that. He cursed Alan as a sly jerk of a prince, but Alan took it as a compliment. They were quarreling, and Alan asked him to enjoy his time visiting their old school. Both of them were classmates who graduated from that academy. 2 days later, Keith went to the academy. The Royal Knight Academy is the institution which trains young knights who will go on to battle monsters in the future. It's located in the royal capital, and it is the most prestigious knight academy. The place just for the elite of the elite. Seeing his school reminded him of his school days. Keith was only 13 when he graduated from there, and he was a genius who skipped grades. A normal person would normally graduate at 18. He decided to go and see Cell first. He visited her room and she was also happy to see him. She also had the title of Sage and she was senior to Alan and Keith in their school days. They had their little reunion and Cell went straight into the business. Keith would work as the teacher there and in charge of the Class 1A. Since they were freshmen who hadn't been molded into anything yet, Cell believed that Keith would have an easier time with them. She rambled about the preparations she had made for him. She also reduced the numbers to 30 and asked him to use her research facilities in his free time. In the end, everything had been figured out for him. Keith wondered if it was really alright for him to use her research facility. Cell assured him that it was fine as she believed that Keith's research would increase the overall survival rate of all the knights. So Cell was prepared to support him to the best of her abilities. Keith was grateful for her help and thanked her. Cell then mentioned one important thing. She asked him to stop calling her Cell, as she is the board chairman and he was just a teacher. She didn't mind that when they were alone, but she asked him to not do that in front of others. Keith also felt weird to use that childish nickname now. She picked up the letter sent by Prince Alan. He wants Keith to keep his status as Sage a secret, since it would cause quite an uproar if the students knew that a Sage got demobilized. Since Keith never liked to be on the public side of things, Cell was sure that students wouldn't know about him and much less recognized him. But Keith was not sure if he had to be happy about that though. Cell asked him to see further information in the documents and asked him if he had any further questions. Keith inquired about why she wanted him specifically to become a teacher. But he called her as a chairman so that he could get used to calling her like that instead of Cell. He wants to avoid future troubles like that. Cell asked him whether he knew the skewed distribution of deaths among knights. Most of the deaths are of young people who have only been knights for around 3 years. It's become a trend to think of knights as a cannon folder just because there were many of them graduating every year. This is especially true for lower-ranked knight orders. The less competent the commander, the more likely they are to treat their knights this way. Keith's commander Benoit is a great example for that. In the public eyes, knights and monsters are about evenly matched. But to be honest, they are in a pretty dire situation now. Keith also agreed to that as the human territory is still decreasing year by year. It was clear that they lacked the means to go against the monsters. The most they could do right now was to delay the country's imminent and painful destruction. That's the unfortunate reality of things. That's why Cell needed Keith to become a teacher. She tried to avoid having to resort to that, but she and Alan couldn't keep doing this alone. They need Keith to teach the students his methods and findings to renew their resolve and mindset. His principles were superior to the existing techniques, but the noble faction didn't want to acknowledge a commoner. Ever since Cell became the board chairman of the Royal Knight Academy, the skill level of graduates has definitely increased. But on the other hand, the orders shortened the training period for new knights. As a result, the number of casualties still continued to increase. Alan tried to pull some strings behind the scenes, but it will be a while until they could see the fruits of his efforts. Unfortunately, the monsters aren't so kind to wait for them. Cell pleaded with Keith to help the students as she didn't want to see any more reports of the deaths of fresh graduates. Keith didn't realize that Cell had it so hard all this time. So he resolved to try his best to do that. He didn't have any experience training people and he was not sure that he would be good at it. So right now, he couldn't promise that he would be of great help to her. However, his dream to reclaim his home from the monsters didn't change till now. And he was sure that he wouldn't be able to accomplish that on his own. So for his own selfish goals, he decided to try his best to be a good teacher. Cell was happy to hear that. She used magic to teleport from where she was and went near Keith and hugged him. Keith was surprised to see Cell using high-tier magic, Spatial Leap, for something simple. It was the hardest magic to use in the space magic category, which was rare itself. But Keith didn't mind that. In Classroom 1A, the news of a new teacher going to be in charge of their class soon spread. It is also leaked that he was a knight who was fired from a knight order. They hope that the new teacher will be somewhat knowledgeable. Keith is standing outside of the classroom and he heard all those conversations. As expected, the rumors about him weren't really nice. He is waiting for the clock alarm to indicate the start of the class. The alarm rang at 8:30 and Keith started his mission as a teacher. Keith entered the room and all the students focused on him. The whole class turned into silence unlike before. Keith introduced himself and hoped that they would get along. A student raised his hand to ask a question as soon as he finished his introduction. His name was Graham, who was from a low-rank noble family, and his attribute is fire. He is an above-average student. Graham inquired whether it was true that Keith became a teacher after getting fired from a night order. Keith found that he had got some fearless and clueless students in his class. Keith confirmed that he had spent a year on the front lines, but the order felt that he didn't suit them. So he was discharged and assigned there to teach them, the next generation of knights. He answered them bluntly, and the students were shocked to hear that he admitted his expulsion. Soon an uproar arose between them. It was a normal reaction. For a knight, being laid off is considered a great dishonor for their public image. So any normal person would naturally try to conceal that fact. But Keith wasn't afraid of that, as the most they could do was to make fun of him. Another student raised her hand to ask a question. She was Alistra Grantress, and she was the fourth daughter of Duke. She had two attributes, wind and water, despite being a freshman, and she is the topper of that class. She asked Keith whether she could achieve her goal to become a top-ranked knight if she learned from someone who was discharged. Keith replied that it all depends on her, and she inquired further about that. It's pretty clear that there may be a problem with them if the capabilities of the homeroom teacher affect their academic success. The academy has great research facilities that are all at their disposal. And the library is stacked to the brim with all sorts of books. They have the perfect environment to grow and hone their skills. Keith mentioned that they all would be useful if they actually wanted to improve. Alice was angered to hear that explanation. She argued that it was irresponsible of Keith, who was trying to escape from reality. Keith wondered about that. He mentioned that they were free to do their own thing if they didn't like his class, and he won't record their absence, so they don't have to worry about their credits either. Alice hit the desk in anger and accused Keith that he was covering his lack of ability and pushing away his responsibility towards his students. The situation became awkward in the class. Keith asked whether she wanted to say that he was not worthy and that he should shut up because he didn't know what he was talking about. Alice mentioned that she wouldn't go so far as to say those exact words, but that's the general idea of her. Alice is the daughter of Edmund Grantress, the commander of First Knight Order, the most powerful and revered order of all. Keith knew that she did be as proud as her father, so he was expecting a confrontation. But he had never expected that she would take it this far. The top student of this school year seemed promising to him. She's not strong as Sel and Alan used to be, but that's a trivial issue. Keith considered her will to become an excellent knight to be more important than anything. He wondered how far her will would take her. Keith also certainly knew where they were coming from. He mentioned honestly that he thought the same thing quite often himself. Keith remembered Benoit and told them that whenever he saw powerless people acting high and mighty, he also wanted to shut them up. The whole class became silent when he excluded his strong spirit. The alarm broke the silence, which indicated their end of class. The next class is practical training, and Keith took it as an opportunity to make some changes to their lessons. Since many of them seemed to doubt his ability, he wanted to have a mock battle with them. A student objected, as there was no way a student could win against a former knight. So Keith gave them a handicap, and he asked all 30 of them to cone at him at once. All the students were also enraged, as they thought that Keith is underestimating them. Alice reminded him that 3 first-year students are considered to be equal to an average full-fledged knight. Keith also agreed to that, as in the battle of magic, strength is definitely in numbers. So Alice wondered why he was initiating the mock battle when they were sure to win. Keith asked her to wait and see. With that said, he asked everyone to change and proceed to the training grounds. After he left, Alice was so mad about him, as she thought that he was mocking them. In the training grounds, Keith arrived and noticed that everyone was there. Fairy, who was one of the students, inquired whether it was okay for Keith to fight in his formal clothes. Keith remembered that Fairy was a commoner and was in the lower half of the class. She asked Keith to wear the training gear, which was pretty nice and high-tech. But Keith deemed it as unnecessary. That's when Alice shouted to stop the chit-chatting. She thought that Keith was planning to humiliate them. He refused to change the clothes, implied that the students were not worth his time. Keith explained that it was not his intention and he just didn't need any special preparations. She challenged Keith to see whether he would be able to escape without having ruined those clothes. She went ahead and gathered every one of her class members. Keith exclaimed that Alice really hated her. Fairy commented that he hasn't given her much of a reason to not to hate her. Keith asked if Fairy was not going to join them as Ellis is glaring daggers at her. Seeing that, Ferris moved to the group. Keith saw that there were no barriers between nobles and commoners in this class. Furthermore, the reason behind this atmosphere of equality is none other than Ellis. Keith noted that his documents did not contain this information. Though his methods are questionable, he decided to use this opportunity to observe the students' personalities. He watched Ellis making preparations with her whole class. After some time, the whole class is ready to start the battle. Keith warned them before the battle. Since it was a mock battle, all physical damage they would receive will simply deplete their mana instead, and he was planning to attack them like that. In other words, they didn't have to worry about getting hurt, but if they lost too much mana, they would faint. And if that happens, they would have to miss the remaining classes for the day, so he asked them to not go overboard. A student named Bellany wondered if they actually needed to follow those precautions, as there was only one teacher in front of them. He was also a noble with an earth attribute. Keith left it all up to them if they wanted to heed his advice or not. Without much further ado, Keith started the mock battle. As he gave the signal to start, all the students started to create numerous magic circles and aimed at him. Keith analyzed all that magic in an instant. He cancelled all those magic circles with just the slash of his hand. Every student was left shocked there. Keith just tried to use the spell Cell would normally use, but he couldn't be able to execute it perfectly, and it was lame. But the students were shocked by that, as they never thought the knight who got fired within a year would be able to use something high tier. Ellis stopped the confusion between the students. Since they are in the middle of the battle, she asked them to not get distracted and keep an eye on their opponent. Keith didn't counterattack and watched the performances of every student at that time. He teased Ellis whether taking him down in one shot was their strategy. Ellis denied that and implied that she had other strategies. Keith complimented them for that. However, real battles can be quite predictable, so Keith mentioned that they wouldn't always be able to fight according to plan. Keith lifted his hand and stopped it in front of them. Ellis wondered what Keith was planning. As he clenched his fist of his extended hand, Ellis was locked in that place. She wasn't able to move and wasn't even able to speak. He took away Ellis' mobility completely. He pulled her towards him and claimed that he had taken their commander as hostage. He wondered what others would do now. The students are all shocked by that. One of the students accused him as coward. But Keith didn't mind that. He mentioned that the monsters would do this sort of thing all the time on the battlefield. He wondered if they were going to try and tell the monsters that they're cowardly as well. He teased them for hoping like that. He asked them to think of it as a real battle, and he is a monster who had captured one of their precious comrades. He inquired about their next course of action. He wondered whether they would try to rescue her risking more casualties, or play it safe and attack the monster together with their friend. The second option meant they didn't plan to rescue their commander. The others had nothing to counter that. Ellis was determined to die if she became a baggage that drags everybody down. Keith was shocked by her determination. Suddenly Ellis activates a huge magical barrier, and the other students are overjoyed to see that. Keith noticed the magic where she combined her two attributes, water and wind. Normally humans have a limit to how much mana they could use in one shot. But Ellis has definitely broken through that barrier that usually prevents one from going too far. She used that attack to separate from him and casted a huge spell named Alvari between them. Keith noticed that Ellis was already a beast and wondered how much further she could go. He accepted that attack, and Ellis was shocked to see that. The other students had multiple opinions, as some considered that attack was too much, while others believed that Keith asked for it as he looked down on them too much. But only Ellis knew that the fight was not over. It hit him head on, but she noticed that Keith gave her a weird look. But she expected that attack to damage him even a little. But she was surprised to see Keith came out unscathed. Even his clothes are also not wrinkled a bit. The other students were surprised once again. Keith thought that he was doing a pretty good job at restraining her movements. Yet Ellis still managed to attack him. He exclaimed that just showed how unpredictable real battles could be. Ellis inquired how Keith was unharmed. He pointed that as the good and important question. He explained that understanding opponent's strength and forming strategy around that is one of the basics of fighting. He asked her to figure out the answer themselves and exclaimed that maybe they stood a chance to beat him. He gave them enough time to prepare, which would never happen in the real battle. She picked multiple small knives and threw them towards Keith. But the knives were deflected before it hit his body. She found his ability and revealed it to everyone. Keith was a defense-type magician who knew how to use magic barriers. She noticed that Keith was only using it to protect himself and revealed it to everyone. Keith complimented her for noticing it quickly. Ellis had a talent for magic and an unbreakable will, and she also had great observation and analytical skills. With those alone, Ellis was guaranteed to have a good future as a knight. However, Keith noticed that Ellis also had one more thing, and that's a talent as a commander. She guided the other students skillfully as she asked close combat fighters to come forward. She asked others to stand behind and fire spells at Keith and reminded them to be careful so that they wouldn't hit their teammates. They finally started their attack against him. Keith noticed that some of the students have pretty strong attacks. Then he noticed that Ellis was missing from the group. He looked around as he dodged the attacks of the students. She was standing behind and activated another huge spell. Keith noticed that it was another 2 attribute spell and it needed a lot of mana again. He decided to not allow that. He moved from there to behind Ellis in an instant. He asked her to stop that as she wouldn't be able to handle that. He knocked her out and Ellis also lost most of her mana. The students started to keep attacking him to take revenge for Ellis. Keith noted that everyone seemed pretty promising and it seemed that Cell's reforms weren't for nothing. He enjoyed that moment. He rivaled them if that's all they got, and all the students tried their best but no one was even able to touch him. The mock battle ended with Keith's victory. Like and subscribe to watch the future endeavors of Keith and whether he had succeeded to form powerful knight squad. Click on the notification icon to know more interesting stories like this.